Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to our event with Congressman Robert J. Mrazek in a joint Global Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus and Global Veterans and Military Families Caucus event. I'm Nicholas Gordon. I'm a member of the steering committee for the API Caucus, and it's my pleasure to welcome the Congressman to share a few words and answer some questions about his latest book, The Indomitable Florence Finch, the untold story of a war widow turned resistance fighter and savior of American POWs, published last year. A few ground rules. We are recording this event, so please remain on mute. To help keep this a tight recording, I ask that you type any questions into the chat box, and we'll save an informal conversation for maybe after the event if we have some time. So, 79 years ago, American and Filipino POWs were forced to march after their defeat in the Battle of Bataan. This started years of mistreatment in Japanese POW camps. Many survived only due to the help of those on the outside, who snuck in food, medical supplies, and other essentials. One of these people was Florence Finch, then known as Florence Smith. Born to a Filipino mother and an American father, and recently widowed when her husband was killed in a Japanese attack, Florence conducted a scheme to divert necessary resources to the resistance effort while conveying needed supplies to those in the POW camps. Her story of heroism is the subject of Mrazek's book and of today's event. Today, we'll talk about the story of men and women like Florence Finch, Carl Engelhardt, and Bing Smith. We'll talk about Congressman Mrazek's process of writing the book and also perhaps ask him to share a bit about his time as a congressman. Congressman Robert J. Mrazek served as a Democratic member of Congress from 1993, representing New York's 3rd Congressional District. Since retiring from Congress, he has become a prolific author of both military fiction and nonfiction, as well as writing and directing a feature film. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Congressman Mrazek to deliver a short presentation about his book.
Thank you, Nicholas. Greetings to you all from Ithaca, New York, where it is raining pretty heavily as it does this time of year. You know, old politicians, decrepit politicians, are known to exaggerate a great deal, but I must confess that after 11 books, this is really the most amazing story I've ever come across. Tens of thousands of books have been written about men at war during the Second World War, but very few about women who made a difference. Florence was not only a war hero, she was one of the most decorated American women in the Pacific during the Second World War for saving hundreds of American lives. President Truman awarded her the Medal of Freedom, the highest award that a civilian can receive from the president, for all of her accomplishments. And yet we really don't know very much about her. Why is that? Well, we live in an age of celebrity, where celebrities are celebrated for being celebrities without having accomplished anything of substance in their lives. This is a woman of extraordinary humility, maybe the deepest humility that I'm familiar with in a human being. She never told anyone after the war what she had done, including her own children. And 50 years after the war ended, in 1995, the United States Coast Guard decided to name their new Pacific headquarters in Hawaii after Florence Finch. And that was the first time her children became aware of what she had done, and that she had been married before. They only knew her as the mother with their father, Bob Finch, who had served during the war in Europe. It's really a remarkable story. So let's start with slide number 1, Nicholas, because the story begins, well, that's Florence in 1938, shortly before the war. Let's go back to number 1, which is a slide of Florence's father. His name was Charles Ebersol. This picture was taken when he was 17 years old. He had just joined the Army as a medic, being trained as a medic. This was in 1899. He had read the stories of the gallant Teddy Roosevelt leading the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill. He volunteered for the Army. At 16, he was not allowed to join. He did join at 17, and he was sent to the Philippines at a time when the war was really heating up between the United States Army and the Philippine insurrectionists. The insurrectionists were thrilled when the United States defeated the Spanish, because the Philippines had been a Spanish colony for 300 years, and they thought when we defeated the Spanish that we would turn over the Philippines to the Filipinos. Instead, we chose to make it our own occupation. And the Filipinos, led by Aguinaldo, challenged us, and they fought a war, a brief, fierce, savage war for 3 years. He got there when the war was at its most savage. Atrocities taking place on both sides, most of them committed by the US Army. And the war coarsened him. And when it ended in 1902, he decided he did not want to go back to Buffalo, New York, which is where he was born and raised. He loved the Philippines. He loved the climate, the culture, the people, the beauty. And there were plenty of opportunities for a young American at that time, because it was now an American occupation. We were building roads and schools and hospitals. And he became a contractor, and he was good at it. And pretty soon he bought a plantation in Isabela province, north of Manila. And he grew that plantation into something very substantial, principally tobacco, high-end tobacco products that he was exporting to the United States. And he became very wealthy on Philippine standards. He met and fell in love with a young woman named Maria. Maria was lovely. She could not speak English. She only spoke Tagalog, which was an indigenous language in the Philippines. Unfortunately for their relationship, she was already married. She was married to a former Spanish soldier. But Charlie, again, I think somewhat coarsened by the war, with a kind of cold-blooded reptilian attitude, said, "I want you to be my common law wife and come with me." And she did. And she had at the time a baby daughter named Flaviana, who was a toddler. And they came with Charlie, and they had 4 children. If we could go to slide number 2, that is Florence Finch in the middle at the age of 6. And that's her older sister, Norma, on her right, and her older brother, Edward, on her left. Edward died very young. At that time, Florence's name was Loring May. Her birth name was Loring May Ebersol. It was a mystery to me when I began researching the project, how she ended up being named Florence. Well, here's what happened. When Florence was 6 years old, her father saw that their stepdaughter, Flaviana, who was Maria's daughter by the former Spanish soldier, was now 17 years old. She was a very lovely version of her mother. She was also much more sophisticated, because Charlie believed in bringing all of the children up to learn English on American standards with American teachers that he brought to the plantation. And when Flaviana got married at the age of 17, Charlie, who was not used to having things taken away from him, followed them to the village where they were living and declared his love for Flaviana and said, "I want you to come home and live with me as man and wife." Obviously, they couldn't be legally married. There was no divorce in the Philippines. It's a Catholic country. But he wasn't legally married to Maria any more than he was legally married to Flaviana. So Flaviana agreed. Charlie was a very persuasive, charismatic man, very powerful man. She came back to live with him at the plantation. And Charlie by then had built a very substantial plantation house on the Callao River near Santiago. And he basically told Maria, I will allow you to live on the plantation, but you and our children together will live in the original cottage that we had on the plantation. I'm going to live in the plantation house with Flaviana. And he proceeded then to have children with Flaviana. 2 years later, when Florence was 7 years old, just going on 8, Maria broke down. In the Spanish term, she went loco, and she began beating her own children as if they were somehow responsible for Charlie taking away their marriage to live with Flaviana. It was then that Charlie took Florence aside and said, I'm going to send you to a new school in Manila called the Union Church School. It was set up by Protestants for mestizas, mestiza being a term for a child, a female child who was half American and half Filipino. And Florence, on her own in a carriage, was sent away to the Union Church Hall School at the age of 7, and she never returned to the plantation. If we could go to the next slide. No, let's go back one, Nicholas, I'm sorry. Yeah, there we are. She lived from the age of 7 to the age of 17 at the Union Church Hall School. It was at a time of significant bigotry by the American and British expatriates toward mestizas, who were viewed as half-breeds, tar babies. That was a term used by one of the women who was an elder in the Protestant church there, which was responsible for teaching them. They were treated as, with sympathy, as if they were somehow not worthy of being Caucasians. It gave Florence, with this level of upbringing, with the Dickensian kind of a childhood, a level of self-reliance and inner strength that would serve her well as she grew older. Her first job when she graduated from college was to work for the Army-Navy YMCA in Manila. Now, the YMCA to us today is, the local YMCA that has the swimming pool and the workout rooms. In Manila, the Army-Navy YMCA was a huge facility because we had the Pacific Fleet located there. It had 500 rooms for visiting Army and Navy personnel. It had restaurants. It was a very substantial operation. She went to work for H.J. Scowcroft, who was the director of the entire operation. And within a few years, she was the de facto manager of the hotel and the operation. She was very smart, very organized. He fell in love with her. She wasn't in love with him, but she handled the situation with great diplomatic skill. And in 1941, she met the gentleman in the next photograph, whose name was Charles Smith. He was from Iowa. He looked uncannily like the crooner Bing Crosby, except Bing Crosby was 5'6", quite diminutive on American standards. Bing was, as they called him, was 6'1", a tremendous athlete. He was the star pitcher on the Pacific All-Fleet Navy baseball team. By then, he was a special agent for naval intelligence, and he met Florence at the YMCA when she was behind the desk supervising one day, and asked her out. And she fell in love with him very quickly. He had already been married. She didn't know that at the time. He was a man's man. He had been in the Navy for 10 years all over the Pacific, was a fairly wise and knowing man, when it came to relationships with women. And in Manila in those days, it was rare that an American married a mestiza. They dated mestizas, but Charlie fell in love with uh, with Florence, but he was not ready to commit. A job occurred across the hall from where naval intelligence was located in Manila, in Army intelligence. And with the deputy director of Army intelligence for the US Army in the Philippines as the war approached. He's photographed in the next slide. This is Colonel Carl Engelhardt. This is him photographed at the end of the war when he was a full colonel. He was a lieutenant colonel in 1941. He was looking for an administrative assistant. Bing recommended Florence to him. Oh, I forgot to tell you how Florence got named. Forgive me. A little senior moment there. Very briefly, when she got to the school, the Union Church School, she was totally inexpressive. She was in shock. And the superintendent of the school, Harvey Bordner, who had been in the Philippines for 20 years, sensed that she was dealing with serious emotional issues and would not respond to the name Loring May. And it was he who recommended that she get a new start, essentially, at the school. And he suggested the name Florencia, flowering flower. And she accepted that and embraced it and became Florence for the rest of her life. In any event, as the war approached, the Japanese had invaded China, were moving on Indochina. Carl Engelhardt was a brilliant intelligence officer. He spoke fluent Japanese. He had been the military attaché in Tokyo between 1928 and 1931. He spoke with a Tokyo accent, according to his Japanese friends, meaning they could not tell that he was not Japanese. That enabled him to read, to study all of the raw material that was coming from across the Pacific, where American and British agents were sending the material back to Manila, where Engelhardt was in charge of assessing it, reviewing it, and making recommendations accordingly. He was strongly believed that the Japanese invasion of the Philippines was imminent, that the Japanese were going to attack the United States. He started in November of 1941, a month before the attack on Pearl Harbor, sending memoranda up to Douglas MacArthur, who was then in command of American troops and Filipino troops in the Philippines. MacArthur had an intelligence chief, a full colonel at the time, named Charles Willoughby. The name sounds Anglo-Saxon, but Willoughby was actually born Adolf Weichenbach in Germany. He was an early admirer of Hitler and Mussolini, and he spoke with a very thick German accent. MacArthur referred to him as his pet fascist. Weidenbach had joined the American Army back in the early 30s, and he basically rejected all of Carl Engelhardt's memoranda that were coming up about Japanese intentions and told Engelhardt to stop doing it because it was obvious that the Japanese were not prepared and did not have the resources to attack the United States. Less than a month later, the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor, and within 24 hours were launching air attacks on the Philippines. It led very quickly to the to the fall of the Philippines, MacArthur retreated to the fortress of Corregidor at the head of Manila, at the head of the harbor in Manila, and withdrew all of the American troops to the Bataan Peninsula, where he hoped to be able to hold out long enough until he could be resupplied by the United States Army and Navy from Hawaii. That was not to happen. Engelhart and Bing Smith left on Christmas Eve, 1941, to go to Corregidor. And at that point, Florence was left alone. The attack on Bataan by the Japanese army led to very fierce fighting. Bing, who had been a naval chief petty officer in the Navy, went back to a small ship that he had served on prior to the war that was based near the Bataan Peninsula, on a gunboat off the Bataan Peninsula during the fierce fighting when the Japanese had launched an attack, an amphibious attack. He led an attack on the Japanese from a gunboat, wiped out their positions, but on returning, in returning to their base, they were attacked by 2 Japanese warplanes, fighters, and he was killed, saving several crewmates, giving up his place behind armor plate to save several crewmates. He was killed in the action and was given the Distinguished Service Cross by Douglas MacArthur, the second highest award for military bravery after the Congressional Medal of Honor. Engelhart was given a carbon of the citation, the award that his friend had received, Bing Smith. And when Corregidor fell to the Japanese, it was Carl Engelhart who, on behalf of the local American commander, negotiated the surrender of American forces to the Japanese. And one of the members of the Japanese party that was orchestrating the surrender was so struck by his ability to speak Japanese so fluently that he spoke to Engelhart after the surrender and said, I know you're going to be going to the prison camps, but I'm wondering if there's anything I can do for you. And it turned out he was a member of the Japanese royal family. And Engelhart said there was one thing he could do. And he pulled out the carbon of the citation that Bing had earned for the DSC. And he gave it to the Japanese officer. And he said, I have a very good friend who is now a widow. She has no idea what has happened to her husband. I'm wondering if you could take this to her or have it delivered to her in Manila so that she won't be facing uncertainty for the years ahead and will know that her husband died bravely. And the Japanese officer understood that attitude, samurai, and he promised to do that. And that led to him going to Manila, the Japanese officer, and giving the citation to Florence. And that is how she learned that Bing was dead. She went through, obviously, a great deal of emotional stress. She had lived a fairy tale marriage as long as it had lasted. And she came to a commitment that she would do everything she could in his honor to help defeat the Japanese occupying authority. She had no idea what it might be, but she made that commitment. And some months later, she saw an ad in the Manila Star newspaper for employees being sought who spoke fluent English and wrote well in English for the Philippine Liquid Fuel Union, which sounds like a benign organization, but it was run by the Japanese. 98 Japanese officers operated the Philippine Liquid Fuel Union, and it dispensed all of the gasoline, diesel fuel, kerosene, and other liquid fuels to the Japanese military, the Army and the Navy. Whatever was left over could be rationed to the Filipinos. And Florence sought a job there. She, by then, had been in contact with Engelhart, who wrote to her through an underground mail system that was set up by the Americans very cleverly, with men who were bringing supplies to the Japanese in ox carts. And they were bribed by a very industrious American prisoner to bring in messages, to send out messages from the prisoners to former friends in Manila, and to bring in messages from those friends to the prisoners. It was through that underground mail system that Florence learned that Engelhart was still alive. He wrote that they were dying by the hundreds, 500 a week at the time, because after the Bataan Death March, in which 70,000 Americans and Filipinos were marched for 60 miles in that tropical heat without food or water, thousands of whom died on the way. Many thousands died in captivity after the Bataan Death March. Engelhart was one of them. And when he wrote to Florence, "Is there any way you can help us with food or medicine?" she saw the opportunity of working at the Liquid Fuel Union as a chance to help. What motivated her, what inspired her, was reading in the weekly newsletter from the Philippine Liquid Fuel Union to all of its employees that 2 men had been arrested for falsifying warehouse receipts and fuel coupons. And she realized, here, I am filling out legitimate, genuine fuel coupons and warehouse receipts. And she conceived the idea of filling them out for people, friends of hers. She would create a network. The coupons would go to those people in the underground network. They would sell the fuel on the black market, which was flourishing at the time, and then take that money and buy food and medicine, which she would then ship into the Cabanatuan prison camp, where there were about 40,000 Americans by then, trapped without enough food to survive. And she became one of the principal suppliers of food and medicine into the camp. She learned from Engelhart. If we could get to the next slide. This is a slide of Carl Engelhart taken secretly within the Cabanatuan prison camp in 1943. And by then he had put back on some weight. He had come very close to death by starvation. He had told Florence that if you can get us money, if you can get us cash, and not the Japanese vouchers, but real Filipino money or American dollars, we can use that to bribe the guards for additional supplies and food and medicine, which is what she did. By then, she had created an entire underground network. She was working with the Philippine underground, or one of the many cells, if you will, of the Philippine underground. They were taking some of the fuel for themselves to oppose the Japanese, and they were continuing to sell the rest on the black market. She was then sending money as well as food and medicine into the camp, and through Engelhart, it eventually saved hundreds of Americans. She did this for 2 years, 2.5 years, under the eyes of 98 Japanese military officers who were running it. And it was complicated and dangerous because every Monday morning, she had to get to the office and go through all of the warehouse receipts and warehouse coupons and find the ones that she had filled out, because otherwise the Japanese would know immediately that there was a loss of 200, 300, 500 gallons of fuel a week. She had to do that under their eyes. and she was able to succeed, as I said, for 2.5 years. In October of 1944, one of her couriers was arrested trying to smuggle medicine into the camp. Under torture, revealed that Florence was the head of her organization. She was arrested on October 16th, 1944. She was taken to the Kempe Thai headquarters in Manila at what was called the airport studio. The Kempe Thai was the equivalent of the German Gestapo. They were the secret police. They could arrest anyone, including high-ranking Japanese. They could use whatever methods they wanted to extract information, including torture. They could execute anyone at their will. I will not go into detail about the level of torture that she underwent after she was placed in a 2-foot by 4-foot cell, but it was significant. She refused to identify the people that she worked with in her network. She confessed to her own role, but under torture, again, refused to say who she worked with. She was then sent to a political prison outside Manila, where the inmates were being executed when they continued to refuse to reveal any information to the Kempe Thai. Shortly before she was scheduled for beheading by the Japanese, by then the United States Army under Douglas MacArthur had invaded the Philippines in the fall of 1944. They were rapidly approaching Manila, and MacArthur sent on a contingent of the 1st Cavalry Division to try to free the prisoners who were left in these political prisons in Manila. And one of the people that they saved was a diminutive woman, by then 77 pounds, named Florence Finch. And Florence was nursed back to health. A couple of months later, she was informed that because she was an American citizen through her father, married to a decorated American hero, that she would be allowed, if she wanted to come to the United States, the land of her father, which she had never visited. And she decided to come to the United States. And that was toward the end of 1945. And she was put on a ship, and in San Diego got on a train and rode across the United States on her own to Buffalo, where her father's sister, Mabel, was living. And there she lived for a few months with her father's family. And it really struck her that with the war continuing in the Pacific, by then the war had led to the invasion of Okinawa, a huge battle taking place, thousands of American casualties. Florence decided she hadn't done enough in terms of her pledge to her late husband, Bang. So she volunteered for the Coast Guard and was undergoing training when the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And although she was training to go back to the Pacific, the war ended. Carl Engelhardt came back from a prison camp in Korea, where he ultimately had survived after being put on 3 ships that were sunk by the Americans, a submarine, American Air Force, ships that were carrying American prisoners back to Japan and Korea to work in mines to replace the Japanese who were lost to the war. He barely survived. None of the people in her network survived. Engelhardt searched for her in Manila and learned that she had left the Philippines for the United States. They reunited in Washington, D.C. In late 1945. It was then that Carl learned how she had accomplished everything she did. It was Carl who submitted the information that led to President Truman giving her the Medal of Freedom, which she received in 1947. By then, she had met and fallen in love with Bob Finch, who had served with Patton's army across Europe in World War II. They got married, had children, and Florence had the kind of personality where she really never looked back. She obviously confided to Bob Finch what she had done in earning the Medal of Freedom, but they never talked about it to their children, nor what he had done for that matter. And it was in 1995 when her children learned that Florence Finch, that's the photograph taken in Hawaii when she was there for the dedication of the Coast Guard headquarters in Hawaii, named after Florence Finch. And she then went on to live to be 101 years old. Her personality never changed, optimistic, strong, independent. With everything she had lost, she always looked to the brighter side. She became a deacon elected by her fellow parishioners in the Presbyterian Church here in Ithaca, New York, right up until the end. After the book came out, I was contacted by a woman whose mother had been Florence's roommate at the nursing home where she lived for the last 2.5 years of her life. And she said, you know, Florence was the go-to person at the nursing home by the staff. When someone was giving up on life and said, I don't want to live anymore, they would send in Florence to talk to them about cherishing every day and savoring the time that we still had in this journey, in this life. It was a privilege to research and write her story. Just the kind of thing that I became a writer to try to do, to write stories about values like honor and sacrifice and courage and love. And she epitomized them all. I get very emotional even thinking about her. In any event, that is the story, or part of it, of the Indomitable Florence Finch. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about the story.
So thank you so much to Congressman Mrazek for walking us through his presentation about the life of Florence Finch. And at the beginning of the call, for now, please write your questions in the chat box and I will convey them to Congressman Mrazek. I do have one from Tilly Guyard, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing anyone's name incorrectly. But Tilly says, your book has fantastic detail. How were you able to research for the book? Is every detail in it factual, such as the details of Florence's experience as a prisoner? And if I might add a bit myself, what was your process for researching and writing for the book? What were your primary source materials?
Well, I've written a couple of pretty good World War II nonfiction books that required me to travel all over the country and interview the survivors of the groups that I was writing about. I was very fortunate with this story. I couldn't have written it without the cooperation of Florence's family, particularly her son and daughter. She was a prolific letter writer. When her father died in 1928, he had been a prolific letter writer during the 13 years since Florence was born. That was how old she was when he died. And he wrote regularly to his sister, Mabel, in Buffalo. So it gave me a window into his thinking uh, and his life with regard to, Florence growing up on the plantation. And then when he died, Mabel reached out to Florence and said, I want to be in close touch with you. And even though they had never met, they began a very detailed correspondence from the time she was 13 right up until the week of the attack on Pearl Harbor. And Mabel saved all of those letters from Florence and eventually gave them to Florence long after the war. So I had all of those letters, which really revealed Florence from an early age until she became a woman, until she fell in love with Bing, and everything leading up to the war. The biggest hole in the story for me were the early years, the Dickensian time. And the children of Florence, Bob and Betty, said, we don't know anything about it. And she told us her first memories were when she was 7 years old and at the Union Church Hall School. And I thought she must have had some memories of her childhood. It never entered my mind that she would have been simply avoiding telling her children how painful those early years were. And I really lucked out researching some legal records in Manila because I knew that Charlie Ebersol, her father, had built this very substantial plantation in Isabela province. And I wondered, well, what happened to it? He had two families. He had Maria and her family, and then he had Flaviana with her 7 children. And so lo and behold, there, literally yellowed documents in the Philippine justice system. I found 80 pages of court documents in which the battle took place over the course of 50 years between the two families over who would inherit the plantation and the assets. And that included going back to 1931, sworn affidavits from Maria, from Flaviana, all of the events that occurred, of course, through the filter of each side, telling their version of what occurred. But it was that information that enabled me to tell the early part of the story. So I got very lucky with the research, and it allowed me to tell her story with great detail. And then with Carl Engelhardt, it turned out that he had written a 300-page personal memoir of all of his experiences based upon a journal that he kept while he was a prisoner of the Japanese for 3.5 years. And he gave that memoir to Florence when he died in 1995, the same year that the Coast Guard named the headquarters after her. So armed with all of that material, I was really able to tell a much more detailed story, Tilly, than I would have been without all of that information.
Thank you. I have a question here now from Michael Ramos. In addition to being a former congressman, you are an honorably discharged Navy veteran, a former Senate staffer, a former convention delegate, and so much more. After so many years of dedicating yourself to public service, what sparked your interest in researching history and writing books? And to add an addendum from James Lockett, what inspired you to write and co-direct the movie The Congressman?
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I grew up in a family where my grandparents had come from Czechoslovakia, which they viewed as a beacon of democracy in Central Europe, which was invaded by the Germans and then the Russians. They believed that public service was the most important thing one could do with their life in a country like the United States of America. So I grew up in a family like that, with that inspiration, but I was not planning a career in public service. I wanted to be a writer from the time I was a kid. And when my favorite courses at Cornell University between 63 and 67 were creative writing courses and film courses. I went into the Navy. I went to OCS, after Officers Candidate School, after I graduated from college. I was hurt in a training accident, and I ended up spending almost 3 months in Newport Naval Hospital. And when I got out, I had applied for the London Film School, which was then at Covent Garden in London, England, because I could not be a line officer in the Navy, and I had a lot of time lying in a hospital bed thinking about what I wanted to do with my life. And I decided I wanted to be a filmmaker and a writer. So I was at the London Film School in between January of 1968 and June of 1968. And I loved it there. It was a wonderful place to be at the time. You had great filmmakers who would come to the film school, and they would spend a week with us talking about how they prepared a movie, the various projects they worked on. David Lean, Orson Welles, Fred Zinnemann, who became a lifelong friend, who wrote or who directed High Noon, From Here to Eternity, A Man for All Seasons, and many other movies. But then in April of 1968, Dr. King was murdered. He was one of my family's greatest heroes, and that hurt very deeply, as it did for many of us who were alive at the time. And then in June of 68, Senator Robert Kennedy was murdered. And all of a sudden, it seemed that what I was doing was very trivial there in London. And my country was being torn apart. And by then, I was very angry about the war. I came back to Washington, D.C. I got a job with a United States senator who was opposed to the war. And basically, I took a 30-year detour from what I had originally decided I wanted to do with my life. So when I left Congress in 1993, I thought to myself, well, you wanted to be a writer when you started out. Maybe this is now a chance for you to do it. I wrote 2 busted novels that didn't see the light of day. The third one got me an agent and became a very successful book. I'm not sure why. It was a Civil War novel. It won the Michael Shara Prize. The man who wrote The Killer Angels won the Pulitzer. And that really set me on my way. I love the writing life. I've enjoyed it so much. It's totally different from being in public life. You know, I used to represent 600,000 people. I would see hundreds of people in a given week. As a writer, living anonymously in a place as I do, I rarely see a lot of people, and I love it. And I love going in my imagination to places I want to be. And now to you, Mr. Lockett, in terms of the movie, I had written a lot of screenplays that never saw the light of day, because when you're an author of a book, you're the master of your own little universe. You write the book, it's either validated by being sold to a publisher or it's not. I've been very fortunate with the last 11 books I've written that they've all found good publishers. But I'd always wanted to make a film. And of course, the difference with writing a book or making a movie is somebody has to write a check for typically millions of dollars. And I met a gentleman, again, one of those fortunate intersections in life. I had sent him a screenplay about it was a Vietnam story, Dead on Arrival with the studios. But it was sent to a guy named Fred Roos, and Roos. And Fred produced all of Francis Coppola's movies, from Apocalypse Now through The Godfathers and all of the movies since, and also Sofia Coppola's movies. And Fred is a remarkable man, still going strong in his 80s. And he read the screenplay for the movie I had written that became The Congressman. And he said, you know, this is a small canvas story. We can raise the money to make this movie, and I can get you a good cast, because, you know, I thought to myself, how do you convince a really serious actor to make a film with somebody who's never made a movie before, written or directed a film, a feature film? But he said, don't worry, I'll tell them they're not going to be embarrassed. By then, we had met numerous times. And he got us a wonderful cast starring Treat Williams as the congressman, Jane Atkinson, Elizabeth Marvel, George Hamilton, just, you know, people who came, worked on the movie, and it turned out to be a good little film. I'm very proud of the movie, and it was done on a very small budget. But if I never make another one, I'm proud of the one that we did make.
Okay, I'm going to ask 2 more questions from the floor, and then we'll wrap up this event, but stay on the call, because once the recording is done, we'll open it up to a more informal conversation. There are lots of questions, and don't worry, you'll get your time to ask them. But the first question of our last 2, from Zoe Paglinoan, as a Filipino American, it's extremely touching. The story is extremely touching and personal one. How have the families of the other main characters reacted to this book, and especially the Englewood family, or the Englehart family?
Yeah. Let me first say to Mr. Lockett and others, the movie is available and free on Amazon Prime. So I hope you'll download it and enjoy it. Well, you know, there were limitations to my research. By the time I started researching the book, Carl Engelhart had passed away. His wife had passed away. His son had died young after an injury he received serving on submarines after the war. I knew that he had a daughter. I wasn't sure if she was still alive. I worked assiduously to try to trace her and was unable to do so. So I really worked off of the memoir that Carl wrote, and also the letters. Again, Florence, prolific letter writer. She and Carl Engelhart were communicating in letters and visits for the rest of his life. So I really struck out in terms of Carl Engelhart. I did reach out to the family of Flaviana, who was both Florence's stepsister and her stepmother. One of those China, if you remember the movie Chinatown, it was that kind of a relationship. Flaviana's children, some of them are still alive. I reached out to the grandchildren and was able to gain information that hopefully strengthened the book. But principally, I was working through Florence's family and all of the materials that I benefited from through their custodianship of the Florence archives.
All right, one last question from the floor, and then again, we'll wrap up and then open it up for informal conversation. This question is from John Natowski. As a mixed race person, he's curious whether Florence Finch ever expressed her feelings about being a mixed race person in America. And I think I'll add in the Philippines in addition to that as well, especially given the time and age she lived in, which you mentioned where the concept of race mixing of a mixed person was offensive.
Yes, she did not speak about that in her writings, but she talked about it in videotaped interviews she did with her her son Bobby. Which brings up, again, one of those fascinating little sidelights about Florence and her personality. In 2008, she was diagnosed with a deteriorating spinal disease, which the doctors told her would prove fatal. And as she began to lose the ability to walk and even sit up in a wheelchair, she was put in a hospice program here in Ithaca. And she called her son, Bobby, who was then in Denver, Colorado, and said, Bobby, I'm going to stop drinking water and eating food on Monday. I don't want to be a drain on the family. I don't want to be an emotional burden on the family. And I don't want to be a financial burden on the family. And so I don't see any reason to live under those circumstances. He immediately flew here to Ithaca, went to the hospice facility where she was, and begged her not to take the step. And she, I think you can tell if you've read the book, when she made a decision, she generally adhered to it. But he very cleverly at the time, and in the interest of not allowing her to follow through on this, he said, okay, I will accept that decision, but I want to begin videotaping you for the memories that you can hopefully provide to the grandchildren. By then she had a number of grandchildren. She agreed to do that. And you can see in the first video that he did of her, how close to death she really was, lying there and speaking into the camera when he asked her the first question, what is your first memory? And very haltingly, she said, I am in a forest and my mother is calling me, Loring May, Loring May. And those were her first memories on the videos. It led to her eventually videotaping her for 18 hours. And you can see in the progression, on the Monday she said she would stop eating. She was really getting into doing the video interviews and said, okay, we'll keep going. And about a week into the interviews, she had underwent more tests, and it turned out she was misdiagnosed. And she lived for another 8 years. But in any event, I'm sorry, John, going back to your question, it was in those interviews that she spoke about what it was like to be a mestiza, growing up at the Union Church Hall School with people of generally goodwill who had a Protestant ethic built upon hard work and faith, but at the same time, people who in many cases really looked down on them as not being pure, if you will. So there was a good deal of prejudice that she encountered. She felt that it strengthened her as a person. She took a great pleasure in being a mentor to the younger mestizas who were coming into the school after she had been there for a while, and having them prepared for what they were going to have to deal with and being able to handle it without being hurt by it, wounded by it. And so she recognized what was involved. I think by the time she came to the United States and had lived here for a while and had gotten actively involved in a church community, people accepted her for being biracial, and she was totally comfortable in living in a place that's about as inclusive a place to live as I've ever found on this earth.
So I want to again thank Congressman Mrazek for taking the time to speak with us today. One actual final question for you, Congressman. What's your next project, and where can people find your work?
I must confess, my creative muse had somehow escaped for a number of years. They happen to coincide with the years of our former president. I must say that it was a real emotional trial for me to live through the presidency of Donald Trump. And it affected me in a lot of different ways. But in part, my creative energy just wasn't there. I was alternately angry, bereaved, and so I must say, thankfully, that with those days gone, and I won't say any more than that on that subject. I'm now working on a sequel to a novel that's quite autobiographical. It was a fiction story with a lurid title called Dead Man's Bridge, with a hero who has a lot of my personality and I'm a lot of guilt, a lot of flaws. And he and I are very similar aside from his physical heroism. In any event, I'm enjoying doing a light book, a sequel to that with the publisher that wanted me to do a series. I'll do at least one more. And I'm also working on the film adaptation of the Florence Finch story with Fred Roos, the gentleman I talked about earlier. And I really think it could be a heck of a limited television series. Maybe too much for a 90-minute film, but certainly a 4 or 5 episode, hourly episode of her amazing story. So those are the 2 things I'm working on now.
I hope you'll allow me to wrap this up by saying a few words about us at Democrats Abroad and the caucuses. We at Democrats Abroad help Americans living overseas to request and cast their ballots from overseas. We help Americans abroad to vote and vote Democratic in elections for president, Senate, and the House, as well as any other election in the United States. We also help represent the interests of overseas Americans to both US politicians and policymakers. The Global Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus advocates on issues important to Asian American Pacific Islanders both in the United States of America and living abroad. The caucus focuses on reaching out to AAPI voters living abroad, increasing engagement in civic and political life, and advocating for laws, policies, and programs that improve the lives of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. The AAPI caucus is hosting numerous events, including tea times for the EMEA and AP regions, and a suite of events planned for AAPI Heritage Month, so stay tuned for more news on that. The Veterans and Military Families Caucus is made up of DA members from around the world who are willing and able to advocate on issues important to the veterans and their families within the United States of America and those living overseas. The caucus welcomes any DA member. The VMF caucus is currently celebrating the month of the military child and will be celebrating Memorial Day globally. Membership to these and any other caucus are open to all members of Democrats Abroad. Go to the DA website to find all our other events in person or online and reach out to your country chapter to see what you can do. With that, I call this event to a close, and thank you, Congressman Mrazek, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to be with you and have a chance to talk about the remarkable Florence Finch. Have a wonderful day, all of you, or you're way ahead of me. So have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Well, don't leave just yet. So now.
No, I won't.